John Terrett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
North Korea says it won't hold any more talks with the South following the collapse of Wednesday's discussions between the two nations' military delegations. And easing the embargo, a loosening of US restrictions on Cuba divides expat opinion in Florida. More on those stories coming up after the break.
We have more flooding to come across northern Australia over the next couple of days. I suspect the main focus for the heaviest rainfall will be just around the northernmost parts of Queensland, pushing up into the Gulf of Carpentaria, just around the Cape York Peninsula. Plenty of shower clouds showing up here. And you can see this long chain of clouds just running through central parts down into South Australia. Heavy showers are going to persist here. Could even see some very wet weather coming towards Alice Springs. Temperatures here at around 34 Celsius. Showers or longer spells of rain pulling away from Western Australia. Still nowhere near the bushfires that we've seen earlier on this week. And notice some rather heavy rain very close to the northwest. Hopefully that should stay offshore. Brighter skies gradually pushing back in as we move towards the weekend. That wet weather will make its way down towards western parts of South Australia. Heavy showers making their way into the southeast as this rain just pushes high pressure out of the way, nudges down across Victoria. Same area of cloud and rain will bring some heavy downpours into southern parts of New Zealand over the next day or two. I think these will gradually make their way a little further northwards. Hopefully a window of drier, brighter weather to come for Friday. Temperatures in Auckland getting up to a pleasant 23 Celsius. Meanwhile, it's not looking too bad across Southeast Asia. Still a few showers into Indonesia, yes, but largely fine and dry for Western Borneo and right the way across Malaysia.
As Washington's allies stumble, one after the other, exposed, losing control and influence, powerless in the face of the people's power, we ask, is this the dawn of a new Middle East? Empire at this time on Al Jazeera.
Hello again. Recapping our top stories on Al Jazeera now, and Italian prosecutors are demanding Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi go on trial immediately. The call follows allegations he paid for sex with a 17-year-old Moroccan dancer and then used his political power to cover it up. Tensions running high between the US and Pakistan after an American shot and killed two armed men he claimed were trying to rob him. Anti-US protests have been underway in Lahore since the incident took place nearly 2 weeks ago. And reports say transport workers will join the mass strikes taking place across Egypt. Pro-democracy protests in Cairo have now entered their 17th day. All this comes as negotiators meet to discuss the future transition of power. Egypt's uprisings being closely watched in Iran. The Iranian parliament speaker, Ali Larijani, blames the US and Israel for bringing instability to the region. He told Al Jazeera's Nick Clark why.
If you look at the countries in this region, many are monarchies, or even those which are republics in name, like Egypt or Tunisia. Their presidents are in power for 30 years. In Iran, democracy is a serious matter. Presidents can only be in power for 2 terms. People vote and politicians change according to their will. But in Egypt, you have a dictatorship. America has created a certain situation for them. We are very clear in our position towards the US and Israel, as we believe they have brought the most oppression and injustice to this region. Behind the scenes, they're the ones that are preventing the Egyptians from making their revolution into a success. The Egyptians have a peaceful protest, but why are they reacting to them with bullets and violence? Scenes broadcast by Al Jazeera show they have thrown horses and camels at the people in Tahrir Square. Americans haven't grasped the reality. It seems they are supporting some kind of revolution of camels and horses, not a true democracy and freedom, as is the wish of the Egyptian people.
The French President Nicolas Sarkozy's banned members of his cabinet from holidaying abroad. It follows revelations that his Prime Minister and Foreign Minister went on free vacations in crisis-hit North African countries. Rory Challens reports.
Prime Minister Francois Fillon would probably like to escape France at the moment. So too would Foreign Minister Michel Alliot-Marie. The problem is that's exactly what's got them both into trouble. Monsieur Fillon took his family on holiday to the Nile resort of Aswan, courtesy of Egypt's unpopular President Hosni Mubarak. And Madame Alliot-Marie is facing calls to resign for flying on a private plane to Tunisia for holidays. That plane owned by a businessman with alleged ties to ousted leader Ben Ali. With pictures like these coming daily from the Middle East, it was very bad timing for the politicians. The French media has had a field day, painting the two as cozying up to despots and autocrats.
How comes that the French foreign minister and the French prime minister were going to these countries at this very moment when, in the case of Tunisia, the repression and the revolt had already started, and at a time when one could imagine that the French diplomacy was aware that there was a risk of contagion.
But the Prime Minister insists he's done nothing wrong.
I have strictly respected all the rules related to private trips abroad for the Prime Minister, as well as the President of the Republic.
But even if no rules were broken, President Sarkozy knows this looks bad, and new guidelines have been issued.
For the
holidays, from now on, members of the government will have to prioritise France. Invitations abroad will be authorised by the Prime Minister, in agreement with the diplomatic sections of the French presidency.
Some, though, might question the wisdom of putting the Prime Minister, one of the culprits here, in charge of preventing any further embarrassments. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera.
Jordan's King Abdullah's sworn in a new government. The reshuffle was prompted by protests calling for change in the country. They were inspired by the demonstrations in Egypt and Tunisia. Ex-Army Chief General Maruf Bakit becomes Prime Minister, and he's been tasked with implementing new legislation. North Korea's military says it will no longer engage in dialogue with South Korea. The statement coming after talks between the two countries collapsed on Wednesday. Pyongyang claims Seoul's armed forces were only interested in maintaining tension on the peninsula. Harry Fawcett reports.
Day 2 of these talks was recorded in still pictures, not video, and in the end there was a similar lack of movement in the positions of the two sides.
Today, South and North Korea proceeded with the second working-level meeting for the inter-Korea high-level military talks in the House of Peace in Panmunjom, but it ended without agreement.
South Korea wanted any high-level talks to centre on and result in so-called responsible measures for 2 fatal incidents in 2010. The shelling in November of Yeonpyeong Island, south of the disputed Western Sea border. 2 Marines and 2 civilians were killed, and the sinking of its Chonan warship in March with a loss of 46 lives. According to the South Korean account, the northern delegation said those issues would only be embraced as part of a wider discussion about provocations by both sides, not good enough for their southern counterparts. After the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island in November last year, one respected measure of public sentiment put the proportion of South Koreans either concerned or very concerned about the security situation at a record high, more than 80%. At Seoul's War Memorial Park, there was little optimism that the talks would advance the cause of peace.
Before any talks, the North should have provided a sense of trust. Without trust, real dialogue cannot happen.
We have to provide aid to the North when we have to, but now it is time to stick to principle. North Korea should make an apology.
One Conservative member of the Parliament's National Defence Committee says any further talks will founder on the same issue.
They will talk, but they cannot find any point or any space or any area of cooperation or agreement.
There is another view that North Korea is becoming increasingly desperate for a resumption of aid, and that its sheer willingness for talks in the first place signals a potential appetite for compromise. But in 2 days of discussions this week, compromise was as elusive as ever. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
Cuban Americans are assessing the potential impact of a new White House policy on relations with their homeland. The Obama administration's eased travel restrictions and increased the amount of money Americans can send to their relatives in Cuba. Kimberly Halker reports now from Miami.
Okay, it's coming up.
For Domingo Amorsastegui, preparing Cuban coffee is a daily ritual. But he says it's bittersweet, much like his memories of living in Cuba under the United States economic embargo. The U.S. put commercial limits on Cuba when Domingo was just a young man to push it towards democracy. After 50 years of waiting, Domingo says President Obama's recent relaxing of some restrictions is just a rehashing of a Clinton White House policy.
Expectations were higher. And the fact that they are not coming up with fresh ideas, fresh initiatives, something that will go beyond what we have already experienced one way or another.
Admittedly, this easing of restrictions is not a dramatic shift in White House policy towards Cuba. So you can understand why older generation Cuban Americans, like the ones gathered here in Little Havana in Florida, say they're somewhat skeptical. They say they've seen it all before. But when it comes to the younger generation, they're more optimistic.
Felice Gorordo heads up a Cuban student movement called Roots of Hope. He says the communist government has just issued 75,000 self-employment licenses to offset massive state layoffs and encourage entrepreneurs.
It's significant because for the first time there is some sort of a movement and some sort of change going on the island. And it's important for us to reach out to our counterparts now more than ever before.
Gorordo wants to inspire young Cubans to think beyond the U.S. embargo and provide tools for Cuban workers to succeed. His latest project, collecting used cell phones, a luxury few can afford.
And this is significant for Cuba because up until 2008, cell phones were illegal.
But many of the older Cubans